The night was as black as ink, the Atlantic rolling like a living thing under a rising storm. Above deck, the sails cracked in the wind. Below, the air was thick with sweat and salt. Shackled men whispered in a low murmur like the sound of distant drums, words the crew could not understand but could feel. Somewhere among them, crouched near a lantern's faint glow, was a cook. His hands were scarred from years over plantation fires. His back still bore the marks of chains, yet in his eyes burned something the crew never noticed. Not fear, but calculation. The ship was called the Creole, a two-masted brig now filled not with cotton, but with human cargo. It cut a path toward New Orleans, carrying nearly 130 enslaved people, one of the largest such transports in American history. For the crew, this was routine. For the captives, it was a sentence without appeal. And for one man, it was an opportunity. The cook's name was Madison Washington. Once he had tasted freedom, escaped from a Virginia plantation only to be captured again. Now he was shackled for transport deeper south, a punishment meant to crush the last spark of defiance. But it had not worked. Every clang of the chains reminded him not of surrender, but of escape. Above deck, sailors laughed and smoked, unaware that the ship itself had become a fuse. Below, cramped into suffocating quarters, men and women stared at the floor, feeling the rhythm of the sea and of each other's breathing. The Creole was more than a vessel. It was a floating contradiction. Democracy on paper, but bondage in its hold. And drifting somewhere out on the horizon was British territory, where slavery had been abolished. No one knew the exact hour it would happen, only that when it did, there would be no going back. A kitchen knife for butchering salt pork lay hidden in rags. Chains had been tested for weakness. Words passed quietly in darkness, drowned by the splash of buckets and the creak of timbers. Even the sea seemed to hold its breath. How could a man with no weapons, no map, and no freedom seize a ship bound for the slave markets and sail it to liberation? New Orleans in the late 1830s was a city thriving on the domestic slave trade, slave pens, auction blocks, riverboats, all feeding an economy of human trafficking. The Creole was just one link in that chain. Yet even here, change was coming. Britain's abolition of slavery in its colonies meant that any enslaved person who reached British soil could claim freedom. And Nassau in the Bahamas was closer than most Americans wanted to admit. Madison Washington had worked near ports before. He knew the smell of salt and tar, the routes ships took, the winds they followed. He moved between the kitchen and the hold, between the world of the crew and that of the enslaved. His calm leadership drew others. Farm boys, dock hands, men ripped from their villages. They watched the cook and listened. If an opening came, he would be the one to act. Day by day, the tension built. Small acts of defiance multiplied. A glance held too long, a whispered prayer in the dark. The smell of boiling rice and sweat. Footsteps of guards pacing above like a metronome. Washington told them to wait, to be ready. There would be only one chance. And each evening the sea rocked them closer to it. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon. The ship creaked like an old tree. Guards grew restless. A boy dropped his tin cup and a sailor spun around, suspicion flashing in his eyes. One night the cook hid a blade under a pile of rags and thought, tomorrow or never. Above deck the wind howled. Below deck hearts pounded. Was dawn bringing freedom or death? When it came fast, not with gunfire but with motion. Doors slammed, feet thundered on planks, startled shouts burst from sleeping crew. The enslaved surged upward not as a mob but as a plan. Madison Washington moved first, his scarred hands steady. The kitchen blade glinted only long enough to signal resolve. The crew froze, stunned at the sight of men who moments ago had been cargo now standing as captors. There was no wild violence, no chaos, only the sudden inversion of power. The demand was simple. Steer for Nassau, British territory. The stunned captain hesitated. The sails flapped wildly, the compass spun as the course changed. Salt spray stung eyes, ropes creaked, gulls cried overhead. Below deck, women clutched children, listening to the muffled shouts above. Hours passed, the horizon shifting. For the first time, the enslaved felt the wind not as a cage, but as an open door. The Atlantic did not make it easy. Squalls battered the brig, and rumors swirled of an American ship giving chase. But Washington stood at the helm, a cook-turned-navigator, guiding a vessel that was no longer a prison, but a wager. They had crossed a legal boundary, yet freedom was not yet guaranteed. Every mile toward Nassau was a mile of risk. As dawn broke, the harbor came into view. Nassau, British soil. A flag snapped in the breeze. The crew's faces were pale, the captives' faces unreadable. Would the British hand them back? Would American agents storm the docks? The moment the anchor dropped, a crowd of Bahamians gathered, curious, supportive, watchful. American diplomats demanded the property be returned. British authorities weighed law and diplomacy. On the decks of the Creole, men and women waited, the smell of salt and sweat mingling with hope. One by one, they disembarked under British protection. For the first time, they breathed as free people. It was the largest successful slave revolt in U.S. history, yet back home newspapers called it piracy. Madison Washington faded from the headlines, but not from legend. To abolitionists, he became proof that courage could crack the foundations of slavery. To the U.S. government, he was a problem, a precedent that terrified slaveholders. The Creole case became a diplomatic crisis, fueling tensions that would smolder until the Civil War. For the people who stepped off that ship in Nassau, it was more than politics. It was survival. Families were not reunited overnight. Freedom carried its own hardships, yet the moment they walked down the gangplank, chains fell away. The cook who had fed them became the leader who freed them. The defeat of slavery did not come at once. It came in tremors and rebellions, escapes, legal challenges, each one shaking the edifice a little more. The Creole Mutiny was one such tremor, hidden in footnotes but roaring in its implications. A man with burned hands from plantation kitchens had shown that even on the open sea, the slave system was vulnerable. Think of the image: a wooden brig on a gray Atlantic, a scarred cook at the helm, sails full of wind, the horizon wide open. Not a soldier, not a general, but a man America tried to erase, steering toward a foreign shore and a future no law could deny. Was this merely a mutiny at sea, or the first tremor of a moral storm that would one day sink slavery itself?